The smell of freshly cooked jollof rice filled the air as Ada sat on the living room floor playing with her younger brother, Ifeanyi. Their mother, Mama Ada, Joy, hummed a song in the kitchen while their father, Papa Ada, Emeka, sat on the couch reading the newspaper with a contented smile. Their home was not a mansion, but it was warm, full of love and laughter. Ada, come help me set the table, Mama Ada called out. Ada jumped up eagerly, running into the kitchen to grab the plates. Ifeanyi followed closely behind, giggling as he tried to sneak a spoonful of rice before dinner. Ifeanyi, go and wash your hands first before touching anything, Mama Ada scolded playfully. Papa Ada chuckled. That boy will never change. They all sat around the dining table, enjoying their meal together. Their father talked about his job at the oil company, telling stories about his travels and the challenges he faced. One thing was clear, this was a happy family. But happiness can be fragile, and for Ada's family, it was about to shatter in ways they never imagined. It was a rainy evening when Papa Ada left for his business trip. Ada clung to him at the door, not wanting him to leave. Daddy, when will you be back? She asked, pouting. In 3 days, my princess. I will bring you suya and sweets, he promised, patting her head. Mama Ada smiled, though worry flickered in her eyes. Be safe, my love. He kissed her forehead and walked out into the night. The sound of his car fading into the distance was the last thing they heard. 3 days passed. He didn't return. Then the call came. Mama Ada collapsed to the floor, wailing uncontrollably as the news hit her like a hammer. Papa Ada had been in a fatal car accident. He was gone. Ada and Ifeanyi stood frozen, their young minds unable to process what had happened. Their world, once filled with warmth, turned cold in an instant. The mourning period had barely begun when Papa Ada's relatives arrived. They didn't come with comfort or support. They came with accusations. You killed our son, Joy, Papa Ada's eldest brother. Uncle Paul spat angrily. The elders nodded in agreement. Women like you are dangerous. You planned this. Mama Ada was too heartbroken to fight back. But when they began ransacking the house, her sorrow turned into horror. They took his bank documents, car keys, property papers, everything. This house belongs to our brother. You have no right to stay here. Before she knew it, she and her children were thrown out with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was the beginning of suffering she never thought possible. The streets of Enugu were not kind to a widow with 2 children. From a well-fed mother and housewife, Mama Ada was now a roadside hawker, selling oranges and groundnuts just to feed her children. The once bright Ada now walked the streets, carrying a tray of bananas on her head. Mama, I'm hungry, Ifeanyi whispered one night as they sat on the floor of their one-room apartment. Mama Ada wiped her tears. I know, my son. Tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow was never better. Her in-laws continued to pressure her, mocking her suffering and making her life miserable. Then came the hardest decision of all. Uncle Paul said he will take care of Ada, one of the relatives told Mama Ada. He will send her to school. At least she won't suffer like this. Mama Ada hesitated. After what they had done to her, could she trust them? But when Ada's ribs began to show from hunger, and she realized she could barely afford food for both children, she reluctantly agreed. My daughter, you will stay with Uncle Paul. Be a good girl, okay? Mama Ada said, holding Ada tightly. Ada nodded, trying to be strong. I will, Mama. She had no idea she was walking into a living nightmare. The journey to Uncle Paul's house was quiet. Ada sat beside him in the car, staring out the window. Her heart felt heavy, but she reassured herself. Mama said Uncle Paul would take care of me. He promised to send me to school. Maybe things will be better here. When they arrived, Ada stepped out and took in her new home. It was a large house, much bigger than what she had lived in before, but something about it felt cold. Auntie Ngozi, Uncle Paul's wife, stood at the doorway with her arms folded. Behind her, Ada saw 3 children, Tolu, Chika, and Emma, her cousins. They whispered among themselves, eyeing her with curiosity and something else, disdain. Uncle Paul cleared his throat. Ngozi, this is Ada. She will be staying with us. She's family, so treat her well. Auntie Ngozi forced a tight smile. Of course. But Ada saw it, the way her eyes darkened, the way her upper lips curled in distaste. And in that moment, she knew this was not going to be the safe haven she had hoped for. The first night, Ada was given a small mattress on the kitchen floor. This is where you will sleep, Auntie Ngozi said curtly. Ada blinked. But the guest room, a hard slap landed on her cheek before she could finish. You think you're a princess? You will sleep where I tell you to sleep, Auntie Ngozi snapped. Tears stung Ada's eyes, but she bit her lip to stop herself from crying. The next morning, she woke up to a rough shake. Wake up, lazy girl. Go and sweep the compound. That was the beginning of Ada's new life, as a slave in Uncle Paul's house. She was up before dawn, scrubbing floors, washing plates, cooking meals, doing everything while her cousins sat around watching TV, laughing, and eating the food she cooked. Every mistake earned her a slap, a kick, or harsh words. You are nothing, Ada, a useless burden, Auntie Ngozi spat one night as Ada knelt on the cold floor scrubbing. Uncle Paul? He said nothing. He looked away. Ada had no one to fight for her. At first, Ada hoped her cousins would be kind, but they were worse. See the house girl, Tolu, the eldest, sneered. Are you even part of this family? Look at her clothes, Chika laughed. Even beggars dress better. Emma poured a cup of water on Ada's head. Oops, did I do that? They laughed as she shivered, her clothes drenched. Ada clenched her fists. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to scream, but she was alone. And so, every night, she cried silently on the kitchen floor, praying for an escape. One evening, after running yet another errand for Auntie Ngozi, Ada walked back slowly, her feet aching. She wished she could just run away. You look sad, a voice said. Ada turned and saw a girl about her age sitting under a tree. She was dark-skinned, with long braids and piercing eyes. My name is Grace, the girl said, smiling. What's yours? Ada. Grace tilted her head. Why do you look so sad, Ada? Ada hesitated. Then the words poured out. How she was suffering, how she missed her mother, how her uncle's family treated her like a slave. Grace listened, nodding. I understand. Ada frowned. You do? Grace's eyes twinkled. Yes, and I can help you. I can make them suffer for what they've done to you. Ada blinked. How? Grace leaned in, whispering. I have a secret, and if you trust me, I will show you how to make them pay. Ada was hesitant. Could this girl really help her? But when she remembered the pain, the hunger, the mockery, she found herself nodding. Tell me what to do, Ada whispered. Grace smiled. Come with me. That night, Grace took Ada to an abandoned building deep in the neighborhood. Inside, Ada saw strange symbols on the floor. Candles flickered, shadows danced. What is this? Ada asked, fear creeping into her voice. Grace held her hand. A place of power, a place where we can get justice. Ada shivered. Something felt wrong, but the thought of Auntie Ngozi's cruel face, Tolu's laughter, Emma's mockery, it all made her stay. You have to promise, Grace said. Once you start, there's no going back. Ada clenched her fists. I have suffered enough. I promise, she said. And just like that, Ada took her first step into darkness. That night, Ada tossed and turned on the cold kitchen floor, her heart racing. Grace's words echoed in her mind. I will show you how to make them pay. The next evening, as Ada went to fetch water, Grace was waiting for her behind the compound. She handed Ada a small, dark bottle filled with a strange powder. This, Grace whispered, will make them weak. They will suffer like you have suffered. Ada hesitated. What if they find out? They won't. Just add a little to their food every night. The thought of revenge sent rest and a shiver down Ada's spine. No more beatings, no more insults, no more hunger. She took the bottle. The next morning, Ada stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of steaming yam porridge. Auntie Ngozi's voice rang out from the living room, barking orders at her husband. Ada glanced at the small bottle in her pocket. Her hands trembled. Am I really going to do this? She thought about the bruises on her arms, the empty nights of hunger, the mocking laughter of her cousins. With a deep breath, she sprinkled a small amount of the powder into the food and stirred. Her heart pounded as she served the plate. She watched as Uncle Paul took the first bite, then Auntie Ngozi, then Tolu, Chika, and Emma. She held her breath, waiting, watching. But nothing happened. For the first time in weeks, Ada felt disappointment. Was it fake? Did Grace lie? She sighed and returned to the kitchen, feeling foolish. Then she heard a loud cough. Ada peeked into the dining room. Uncle Paul was holding his stomach, his face twisted in discomfort. Auntie Ngozi wiped sweat from her forehead. Tolu groaned. I feel sick. Ada bit her lip to stop herself from smiling. The next day, they all woke up feeling weaker than before. Uncle Paul struggled to walk to work, his legs shaking. Auntie Ngozi couldn't yell as loudly. Tolu and Chika barely finished their food. Ada felt powerful. She met Grace that evening. It's working, she whispered. Grace grinned. Good. Keep going. Ada held the bottle tighter. I will make them suffer. Days passed. The house was quieter than before. Auntie Ngozi stopped beating Ada. She barely had the strength to lift her hand. Uncle Paul began using a walking stick. He couldn't understand why his legs felt so weak. Tolu and Chika stopped mocking Ada. They were too tired to speak. Emma lay in bed all day, shivering under her blankets. Ada watched, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. One night, Ada jolted awake. She found herself in a strange place, a dark, endless field under a red sky. A circle of shadowy figures stood around her, chanting. Their eyes glowed white, their voices were deep and hollow. Ada! She turned and saw Grace, but she looked different. Her face was pale, and her hair floated around her like mist. You are one of us now, Grace whispered. Ada's stomach twisted in fear. She wanted revenge, but what had she gotten herself into? Ada woke up drenched in sweat. Her heart pounded as she replayed the strange dream, the shadowy figures, the eerie chanting, Grace's haunting words. You are one of us now. She sat up, rubbing her arms. What does that mean? The kitchen was dark and silent, but something felt wrong. Then she heard it, a low whisper. Ada turned quickly, her breath hitching, but there was no one there. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shake off the feeling. She had started something dark, and deep down she knew there was no turning back now. At breakfast, Uncle Paul struggled to lift his spoon. His hands shook violently. Auntie Ngozi leaned against the table, her skin pale. Tolu groaned, holding his chest. Even Emma, who always tormented Ada, could barely sit up straight. Ada watched. her hands gripping the edge of the counter. It's working, but Grace's words echoed in her head. Make them suffer completely. That night, Ada took the small bottle of powder and emptied the rest of it into the family's dinner. After this, they will never hurt me again. She stirred the food carefully, her heart pounding. The next morning, the house was in chaos. Uncle Paul collapsed in the hallway, unable to move his legs. Auntie Ngozi fell while trying to stand, her body stiff and shaking. Tolu and Chika screamed for help, but their voices were weak. Emma lay on the floor, unresponsive. The neighbors rushed in, gasping at the sight. What is happening to them? Someone shouted. But Ada, she stood in the corner, watching silently. This was the moment she had been waiting for. News of Uncle Paul's family's strange sickness spread fast. Some said it was a spiritual attack. Others whispered that they were paying for their wickedness. Auntie Ngozi's sister, desperate for answers, ran to a local pastor, Pastor Ben. This is beyond medicine, Pastor Ben said. This is the hand of the enemy. By evening, 4 pastors arrived at the house, ready for prayers. Ada's hands grew cold. They would find out. The prayers began. The pastors anointed Uncle Paul and his family, shouting for deliverance. Ada stood in the corner, frozen, as the voices of prayer grew louder, stronger. Then, without warning, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She gasped, falling to her knees. The room blurred. The candles flickered wildly. Then, she heard the voice. Ada, you belong to us now. You cannot leave. Her body shook violently. The air around her turned ice cold. Then suddenly she screamed. The pastors turned to her, their eyes widening in realization. And in that moment, the truth was revealed. The darkness was inside Ada. The room was chaos. Uncle Paul and his family lay weak and paralyzed. The pastors shouted in prayer, and Ada was on her knees, shaking violently. One of the pastors turned sharply to the elders in the room. Call her mother. She needs to be here now. A neighbor rushed out to find Mama Ada, Joy. When Joy arrived, her eyes widened in horror. She had expected to see Uncle Paul's family suffering. She had never expected to see her own daughter convulsing on the floor, screaming in a strange voice. Tears filled her eyes. Ada, my child, what is happening? Ada's head snapped up. Her eyes were no longer normal. They glowed a deep, haunting black. Then she spoke in a voice that was not hers. She belongs to us now. The pastors immediately intensified their prayers. They shouted, calling on the name of Jesus. Ada screamed, clutching her head. Stop! Stop it! Her body jerked violently, her breath coming in short gasps. Mama Ada collapsed on the floor, weeping. God, save my child. I beg you. Take her away from this darkness, she sobbed. One of the pastors stepped forward, placing his hands on Ada's forehead. Whatever spirit is inside this child, release her now, he commanded. Ada's body twisted unnaturally, and she let out a terrifying cry. Then suddenly, a chilling laugh escaped her lips. A voice, deep and inhuman, spoke. She came to us willingly. She wanted revenge. The room froze. Everyone turned to Ada, whose face was now filled with guilt and shame. Mama Ada's voice trembled. Ada, is this true? Tears rolled down Ada's cheeks. Yes, Mama, she whispered. I did it. I made them sick. Gasps filled the room. Uncle Paul's wife, Auntie Ngozi, forced herself up slightly. You did this to us? Tolu and Chika stared at Ada in shock and fear. Ada broke down completely. They treated me like a slave, Mama. They beat me. They mocked me. I was hungry every night. I just wanted them to suffer the way they made me suffer. Mama Ada covered her mouth, unable to believe what she was hearing. The pastors continued praying. She was manipulated by the enemy, one of them said, but now she must be set free. Ada wept bitterly. I don't want this anymore. I don't want the nightmares. I don't want the voices. Please help me. Pastor Ben nodded. Then you must renounce them. The pastors circled around Ada, laying hands on her. Say it, Ada, Pastor Ben instructed. Say you reject the darkness. Ada's body shook violently. The air felt heavy. Then she screamed the words. I reject you. I reject this power. I don't want it anymore. A loud wind rushed through the room. Candles blew out. Ada collapsed. For a few moments, the room was silent. Then she opened her eyes, her normal brown eyes. Mama Ada grabbed her daughter, crying loudly. My child, my Ada, you are free. Thank you, Jesus. The pastors sighed in relief. Ada's chains had been broken. But the nightmare wasn't over. Everyone now knew the truth. Ada had poisoned her uncle's family. Though she had been delivered, the damage was done. Uncle Paul's wife, Auntie Ngozi, glared at her with pure hatred. She should be taken to the police. She tried to kill us. Mama Ada shook her head, holding her daughter protectively. She was just a child. She was desperate. Pastor Ben stepped forward. This is not a matter for the police. This is a lesson in mercy and forgiveness. Uncle Paul, still too weak to stand properly, sighed heavily. Let her go. She has suffered enough. Ada looked down, guilt consuming her. Even though she had gotten revenge, she realized the truth too late. Darkness never solves pain. It only creates more suffering. And now she had to live with what she had done. The days after Ada's confession were heavy with silence. Uncle Paul's family remained weak, slowly recovering. Mama Ada did everything she could to help. She cooked, cleaned, and apologized over and over again. But Auntie Ngozi never spoke a word to Ada. Tolu and Chika refused to look at her. Emma would flinch every time Ada entered the room. The guilt weighed on Ada's chest like a rock. She had wanted revenge. But now she realized, revenge only left her emptier than before. One night, she sat outside staring at the sky. Mama, she whispered, do you think they'll ever forgive me? Mama Ada sighed, rubbing her back. I don't know, my child, but we must try. Ada took small steps toward making things right. She made breakfast for Uncle Paul's family every morning. She cleaned their rooms, helped Auntie Ngozi with the laundry, and even fetched water without being asked. But no one said thank you. One afternoon, as she carried a tray of food to Uncle Paul's room, Chika suddenly blocked her path. You think food will fix what you did? She hissed. Ada's hands trembled. I just want to help. You should have thought of that before poisoning us. Tolu walked up behind her, arms crossed. You're a witch, Ada. We don't want your help. Tears burned in Ada's eyes. She had hurt them deeply. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't deserve forgiveness. She placed the tray down and walked away. That night, Uncle Paul finally called Ada into his room. She stood nervously by the door, staring at the floor. He looked weak, but his voice was firm. Come in? Ada stepped forward. Uncle, He raised a hand. No need to explain. I know what you did, and I know why you did it. Ada swallowed hard. Uncle Paul sighed. We failed you, Ada. We treated you badly, and in return, you did something unforgivable. Ada clenched her fists. I was angry. I know, Uncle Paul said, and I should have protected you. But darkness doesn't solve pain, my child. Ada's throat tightened. Will you ever forgive me? Uncle Paul was silent for a long time, then finally he nodded. Yes. Tears streamed down Ada's face. It was the first step toward healing. Auntie Ngozi was the last to speak to Ada. One evening, she sat Ada down and looked her in the eye. "I hated you," she admitted. "I wanted you gone, and I was cruel." Ada's heart pounded. "But what you did to us," Auntie Ngozi shook her head. "It was worse than anything I ever imagined." Ada lowered her gaze. "I know." Auntie Ngozi took a deep breath. "I can't forget Ada, but I can try to forgive." Ada's lips trembled. "That's all I can ask for." That night, as Ada lay on her bed, she realized something. She had wanted power, but power was nothing compared to the strength of forgiveness. She had wanted revenge, but revenge only brought more suffering. And now she had a second chance. She wouldn't waste it. Weeks passed. Uncle Paul's family fully recovered. Tolu and Chika still didn't trust Ada completely, but they no longer treated her like a stranger. Auntie Ngozi let her eat at the table again. And one morning, Uncle Paul kept his promise. He enrolled Ada in school. As she walked into the schoolyard for the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She had walked through darkness, but now she was finding her way back to the light. And this time she would never lose herself again. Revenge may feel like justice, but it often leads to a deeper darkness. Ada thought punishing her uncle's family would heal her pain, but in the end, it only created more suffering, for them and for herself. Forgiveness is not easy, but it is the only way to truly be free. No matter what life throws at you, never let hatred turn you into something you are not. Choose light, choose peace, and always remember, revenge may win the battle, but it never wins the war. If you enjoy this story, please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe to this channel.